So thank you everybody for joining us today. So I have the pleasure to introduce Branco, who is our speaker today. And I was joking a few minutes ago that I dropped the piece of paper in which I had written notes on his career history. So I'm going to go by memory, and he can correct me when I'm wrong. But so Brett went to the University of Connecticut for his bachelor's in coastal studies, and then is a bit of what I would call a Yukon lifer, in the sense that he then continued to get his PhD at the University of Connecticut in oceanography. After which he spent, let me make sure. Nope, you got to go Huskies. Okay. Nice. After his PhD in 2007, Brett spent some time as a postdoc in Western Australia, and then eventually found his way to CUNY, particularly to Brooklyn College, in the Department of Earth and Environmental Sciences, where he is now an associate professor. In addition, since 2019, Brett has become the executive director of the Science and Resiliency Institute at Jamaica Bay. And this, in addition to his research, which is focused on kind of coastal waters and kind of helping to translate and integrate science into policy and solutions, this is actually a big part of the mission of the Institute, which really focuses, of course, on Jamaica Bay, but how to work with communities to not only understand the ecosystem, but also to help make the ecosystem more resilient to future climate change, as well as build back some of the natural resiliency that had originally been there. And so I think I won't talk any more about that, because I believe that's what Brett's going to go into here for the seminar, which is a little bit more about the Institute and the work that they do, and maybe how those of us here can be even more involved than they already are. So I'll turn it over to you, Brett.
Thank you, Kevin. Oh, I should turn this on.
Yeah, perfect.
Okay, great. So thank you for that introduction. Thank you for having me here. I just want to say right off the bat, this is not going to be a research talk, but it will be a talk about research, right? I'll make that'll become clear as I go along. But where's the students? There's okay, all clustered over here. Okay, I'm mostly going to be talking to you guys in some ways, right? Because part of what I'm going to talk about. Well, sometimes I wonder how I ended up in the position I'm in right now as a director of this institute, right? Got a PhD in oceanography. I very rarely refer to myself as an oceanographer these days. I feel very far removed from that part of me these days because of the work that I do. And you know, I think as a researcher, first of all, I would get distracted a lot because there were so many things that I would find interesting. I would have a tendency to jump from one thing to the other, like, oh, this is really cool, I want to look at that. Oh no, this is really cool, I want to look at that. And I feel like over time that kind of made me somewhat of a generalist. And sometimes that was difficult, right? When you're pursuing grants, sometimes being a generalist when you're trying to pursue research can be a detriment, right? Because you don't have like that one really specific focus that makes you like the expert in this thing, right? But in my current position, being a generalist is actually really super valuable, right? Because my job these days isn't so much to do the research myself, it's to figure out what the research that needs to be done is in partnership with people, and then bring together the teams of people to actually do that research that's needed to answer questions. And I'm going to talk about that quite a bit today, right? It's not a position that I thought I would find myself in, but it's a very rewarding position, right? And I think it actually capitalizes on my strengths as an individual. And I'm telling you this because you probably don't know what your career trajectory is going to be like. And so I'm going to give you a taste of one possible trajectory that your lives may take after you finish your education here and move on to your next thing. So in this talk, pretty much what I'm going to do is, first of all, like, we are the Science and Resilience Institute at Jamaica Bay. So I'm just going to talk a little bit about Jamaica Bay as a place, like the different ways that you can think about Jamaica Bay and its significance. Like, why would we have an institute just about this place? Well, there's some very good reasons why you would. So we'll talk about that a little bit. Then I want to talk about the role of what I'm going to call a boundary organization, which is what I like to think the Institute is, as a facilitator of not just research, but research that leads to real solutions that are important to communities and important to agencies and important to decision makers, et cetera. Right. So I'll talk about the role of boundary organization and why it's a moral, what I like to think of as a moral imperative for publicly funded institutions like CUNY and SUNY to serve in these particular roles. And then finally, I'll give you a couple of examples of how how user-driven research happens in the context of the Institute. So I'll highlight a couple of projects that we're working on. And I'd like to point out, in the past 12 months, we've brought in $11 million of research and program funding, and not a single dollar of that money has been something that was initiated by a researcher. Almost every dollar was initiated by a user coming to the Institute, articulating a problem, and then asking for help in addressing it, right? And so I'm going to highlight a couple of those projects and how they're done as partnerships with people like Bassett, right, who's on one of those projects. So that's what we're going to do today. So let's talk about Jamaica Bay as a place for a minute.
I'd have to just tap the screen one more time to get it back.
That's right. We'll just.
Yeah, it probably just needs to be tapped. There you go.
Okay. So the first way to look at Jamaica Bay is to look at it from a historical perspective in terms of like its changing geomorphology over time. And you could start anywhere. I mean, we could start the last glacial maximum, right, when the shoreline was 50 miles further to the east and south of us. So it's really arbitrary where we start. But we'll start in 1844 because there was a nice map then that highlights some of the important aspects of it. So so this was a period when so Jamaica Bay is a shallow backwater lagoon separated from the New York Bight by a barrier island, right, the Rockaway Peninsula, surrounded by a vast complex of wetlands and tributaries. And 1844 was the period where the Dutch had come in and started clear cutting the maritime forests surrounding Jamaica Bay and creating agricultural land. So we can start there, right? Why not? It's good a place as any. That's all these marsh islands in here. I want you to note that the Rockaway Peninsula terminates at about this point, but shallow backwater lagoons like this are highly dynamic places, right? All the masses of sand that form the spits and the islands, they're highly dynamic, they're constantly shifting. But significant alteration of the watershed began around this time, and then this is the present day, right? So this is 150 years of European settlement, and then transformation of the landscape in Jamaica Bay, right? And so a couple of noticeable differences, and these are irreversible changes, right? They're irreversible changes in a lot of ways, right? Almost the entire watershed is now has this thin veneer of impermeable surfaces, which has significantly altered the hydrology and the connection between the land and the surrounding waters. The Rockaway Peninsula, which ended here in 1844, now extends to halfway down the Coney Island. A lot of the wetland complex is now gone, right? It's been filled in and built upon with various airports, Floyd Bennett Field, JFK on the eastern part of it. So there's been a lot of like physical and what I'm calling irreversible changes, and that's important, right? Because this is the system we have now that's available for whatever kind of transformations we might imagine for the future. Another way to look at Jamaica Bay is through its connection with the land. So in this slide, we're showing the watershed. So this is the boundaries of the watershed. If we showed this as a topographic map, you'd see that this is essentially the terminal moraine that runs from Greenwood Cemetery through Prospect Park and then down and forming the northern spine of Long Island. What was I going to say about that? That it's not really so much a watershed anymore, right? The fundamental transformation of the Jamaica Bay watershed is that it's no longer a watershed. We now kind of sometimes refer to it as a sewer shed, meaning that the hydraulic connection between the land and the sea is not through the natural flow of surface water streams and groundwater. It's primarily all the water has been bottled up by pipes, right? So there's still significant freshwater discharge into this backwater lagoon, but it's mostly conveyed by stormwater and sewer piping and discharge from wastewater treatment plants, of which there are 4 significant ones, in addition to an array of combined sewer overflows, right, where stormwater and sewer pipes are essentially one and the same, and during rain events, raw sewage is discharged directly into the bay. So another really fundamental transformation, right? We can think of it as that conversion from a surface watershed to essentially a sewer shed, and how that might have affected the bay. Not to mention the discharge of treated sewage, and of course all that nitrogen that comes with it. We can also think of Jamaica Bay as like the home to people. I know this was a little hard to make out, but these dots represent people and ethnicity, right? And so we can think about Jamaica Bay in terms of the people who live around it. One thing about Brooklyn and New York City, some people refer to it as a melting pot, but it's not. It's a quilt, right? It's a patchwork quilt. So the blue dots represent Black residents, the green dots primarily white, the orange Hispanic, the red Asian, right? So there's different ethnicities that are represented in different areas of the bay with different pieces of their culture that they brought from where their ancestors were, or where their parents and their grandparents were originally from, and different connections with the bay, how they use the bay, or how they think of the bay, or do they even think about the bay? So that people part of it is super important way to think about Jamaica Bay. We can also think of Jamaica Bay and its economic significance, or at least its connection with a major driver of the economy of New York City, which is like the airport. So JFK Airport is on Jamaica Bay, and it's it's a big air cargo airport. It's where a lot of the economy of the city flows through, right, through people and through goods. So that's a really important part of it. And I say that because one of the dominant forces in Jamaica Bay is the Port Authority of New York, New Jersey, right? Nothing can really happen near JFK Airport. So that's an important aspect of it. And then we can think about it in terms of its ecological significance. I know this audience probably does not need to be reminded that I like to think of like marshlands and estuaries as being our equivalent of a backyard rainforest in terms of its productivity on a per acre basis. And that is super significant when thinking about things like the coastal flyway for migrating birds, or places for migratory fish, or even resident fish. So it's just an important ecological place, and it's connected globally, right, through things like migrating birds. So lots of different ways to, and then of course, one of the significant issues associated with its ecological importance is the wetland loss that has occurred from that 1844 map that I shared at the beginning to the present day, right? Just a very significant loss of wetlands, which has been a significant transformer of its ecology. You can also think of it in terms of Land ownership. One of the really super interesting things about Jamaica Bay is that the vast majority of the water mass and the land mass immediately fringing the bay is parkland. Some of it National Park Service land, Gateway National Recreation Area, some of it New York City parkland, some of it New York State parkland, even more New York State parkland now than when I first arrived in 2009. You know, and they're the landowners. They're the landowners, and they have a certain responsibility for stewarding the resources, but also helping to maintain the well-being of the communities that surround Jamaica Bay. Right, so that's another way that we have to think about Jamaica Bay. And just a little quick note, because like the National Park Service, right? If you took in that map, you know, they are a very significant landowner and water owner. And in Gateway National Recreation Area is one of the most visited, if not the most visited parts of the National Park Service system. So you know, it has more visitors to Gateway National Recreation Area than to Yellowstone, right? For example. So it has extreme importance for the National Park Service. So those are all just some different ways, right, that we can think about Jamaica Bay economics, right? The connections with people in the sea, the ecology, the irreversible transformations. And about, well, not about 10 years ago, the city of New York, acting primarily through New York City Parks because they're the big landowner there, and the National Park Service wanted to better coordinate their decision-making and their stewardship of the place, the important place that is Jamaica Bay. And as part of that, they wanted to have a user-driven research enterprise that would help support the decision-making that they needed to do for climate adaptation, to combat the impacts of urbanization, for water quality improvements, all these different things. And so that's how the Institute was essentially born. It was born through a agreement between the City University of New York, primarily through Brooklyn College, which is where I'm based, the city through New York City Parks and the National Park Service. And a party to that agreement was a consortium of other institutions that could bring real research expertise to bear on the important questions, right? So of course, you know, Stony Brook, but also Rutgers, Cornell, Stevens, Columbia, the Wildlife Conservation Society, a lot of other New York City agencies like the Department of Environmental Protection, and the Mayor's Office of Climate and Environmental Justice, that's what they're called now, are connected to this. And I gave Sea Grant an extra big logo because they've been particularly important over the last 10 years in terms of the functioning of the Institute. Like we actually have a Sea Grant extension specialist that's resident at the Institute, works very closely with us, right? So that's the Institute in a nutshell, right? And this collaboration, I almost was going to try to add more logos outside in a third circle to show like all the other entities that are connected in some way to the Institute, but it would have been a ridiculous amount of time to dig up all those logos. It's a lot of partners, a lot of communities involved, a lot of environmental organizations, a lot of civic associations, and a lot of other government entities, which we'll touch upon a little bit as we go. And the mission, you know, the mission is quite simple, right? The mission is to lead in producing knowledge that can be used to make decisions that improve the ecological condition and also human well-being for Jamaica Bay, the communities that surround it, and even more citywide, and perhaps even serve a bit as a model nationally and internationally. That was the aspiration, still is. And in order to accomplish that, you have to do a lot of things. You have to do research. You have to bring the expertise to bear on specific problems. You have to engage in education. You have to engage with the public. A lot of what we do is actually engaging with communities in very real, authentic, and sustained ways. And you have you have to be able to extend that science and communicate with the end users of the work that we do. Sea Grant takes a lot of that role for the science extension role, but as part of the institute. But really what the institute is it's a boundary organization, and this is an organizational type that has sort of grown in popularity, or at least awareness of the importance of boundary organizations. Right? Boundary organizations are organizations that sit at the interface between the research community, decision makers, so that's why I'm calling policy there, and the communities that are affected by those decisions and by the connections with those places. So boundary organizations help facilitate the exchange of knowledge. So they're not there to convey knowledge to audiences, they're there to help facilitate the exchange of knowledge, because sometimes the knowledge has to flow from the communities through, to the institute and then out to the other stakeholders, or from the government, or from different audiences, right? So boundary organizations are super important to help facilitate the research process, and also bring legitimacy to that work. Make sure that the work is salient and important to people, impactful to people, and to make sure that it's credible. This is sort of like I've been reading a lot about transdisciplinary research, right? And boundary organizations are important for facilitating transdisciplinary research, which we may not dive into in a bit. But that's kind of what we are. Just a little bit more about boundary organizations, right? They help connect explicit knowledge, which is oftentimes is created by or generated by the scientific community, but they also help access tacit knowledge, right, which comes from the users, comes from the public, comes from other sectors, and they help again sort of facilitate the exchange of that information. And it's important for boundary organizations to be nonpartisan, to have accountability to all of these different groups, to facilitate the co-creation of new knowledge, and to make sure that science is user driven, right? So these are all important roles for a boundary organization. And this is just reinforcing those ideas a little bit. So just the same kind of idea, just sort of visualized in a slightly different way, right? But what we try to do at the Institute is help develop a common vision of the problems and like what we want the future to be like. Integrate available knowledge, supplement that with new knowledge as necessary. So that's like the research part of it. But make sure that the knowledge that's being created is actionable. That's an important part of it, right? As a boundary organization, the whole point is to help inform decision making. So you would hope that the work that's being done then results in some sort of action, some sort of new policy, some sort of like funded infrastructure project, it's investment in the community, whatever that may be. But then, of course, there's a learning. You have to learn as actions are being taken, and then through an iterative and a sort of adaptive approach, keep the whole process going as we learn from the actions that we take. So those are all things that a boundary organization tries to help to facilitate. And also, I love this from PhD Comics. Boundary organizations can also like really help research communities make sure that their work is relevant, salient, and understood because it's being done in context, right? So this I just like this cartoon because it illustrates how if your research is being done sort of in isolation from the communities that you hope it benefits, the work can, it's like the game of operator, right? As it works its way through the different communication cycles, in the end it can become really misinterpreted, and maybe even cause the opposite impact of what you were hoping for when you started that research. I'll just let you soak that in for a minute. But that's essentially, that's what the Institute is all about. Trying to do all of these things at once, and because we're at CUNY, doing it with limited resources, of course. So I want to talk about a couple of projects that we're involved in. I think it's important to note, I'll emphasize this probably a couple of times, that the Institute does things in partnerships. So almost every project that we're involved in has multiple universities, agencies, civic organizations involved in some way, shape, or form. And I just want to highlight, I just have to do this so that so I don't undersell how important secret is in a lot of these projects, right? So one of the projects that we work on, really the projects we work on right now kind of fall into two major buckets: flooding and nature-based solutions. On the flooding end, one of the because of the historic development of Jamaica Bay, it just so happens that many of the communities that immediately are adjacent to the bay are susceptible to sunny day flooding, which here's a nice illustration from Far Rockaway of what sunny day flooding can look like, right? And that is the flooding that occurs during a full moon or a new moon, depending on the time of year. So some communities see water come onto their streets and onto their property once or twice a month on a fairly regular basis. And this is impactful to them. It affects their quality of life. It affects everything from their ability to receive deliveries, their ability to get to work, the ability for their children to get to school, causes stress. It interrupts holidays, like on December 23rd, though that was a storm. Right, so it really impacts their quality of life. And one of the things that we noticed by talking to communities was that the communities themselves obviously have a great understanding of the flooding that they experience and the impacts it has on their lives. And they also have fairly well-developed communication networks within their sort of like micro neighborhoods, oftentimes existing in like Facebook groups. There's a couple of Facebook groups, like the Broad Channel has a high tide Facebook group where they just share photos about flooding when it happens and remind each other to move their cars to Cross Bay Boulevard because it's going to be a high, it's a full moon high tide tonight. So make sure you move your car. Right, so they have these well-developed communication networks. But this knowledge that they held was not visible to the city because it was all contained within their own like social media networks. And so, with New York Sea Grant, we started this program a few years ago called Community Flood Watch, and basically the whole purpose of it was to take this knowledge that the communities had and make it more visible and useful for the city. The residents were frustrated because they felt like no matter how many times they posted a photo or made a 311 complaint about flooding, nothing ever got done. The city was a little frustrated because they didn't realize, for example, that this particular street would flood twice a month, every month. So the idea was to make this, help facilitate the exchange of knowledge from the communities through this flood watch program. They could document what's happening, and instead of being hidden in a Facebook group, you can make it visible to the city. But at the same time, use that as an opportunity to get information from the city about things that can help the community and make sure that that gets into the community and help build those connections, right? So that's essentially what the Community Flood Watch program is all about. It's been growing ever since. It now includes really important things like Katie Graziano was the secret person that works in our office. So when the Stevens Flood Advisory System is showing the potential for flooding due to the lunar phase and the timing of the high tides and maybe even like the winds or the presence of coastal storm, they will post an advisory about that. Katie takes that information and she packages it in different ways. Because if you ever looked at the Stevens Flood Advisory System for the general public, it's really hard to interpret. So Katie takes that information, she translates it, she puts it out through her network. That gets amplified through Facebook groups and things like that. And so if you're plugged into the Community Flood Watch program, you know it's coming and you can do something to try to mitigate the impacts it might have on you that particular day. So that's the Community Flood Watch program. You know, it's been growing. But 3 years ago, and we've been doing this, I should mention, we were doing this in partnership with the mayor's office, because they were the ones that sort of recognized that this information was not reaching the city agency. So they were very involved. So 3 years ago, the mayor's office approached us and they said, Flood Watch is great. We think it's impactful. You know what we really need to kick this up a notch? We need flood sensors. We need to be able to acquire this information. We can't just rely on people to take photos and tell us the flooding's happening. There should be also some automated way of collecting this information. So they came to the Institute, they said, can you take this up a notch? Can you, is there flood sensor technology we can put out there? Can you guys do this? So we connected with Ricardo Toledo Crow, who runs the Next Generation Sensor Lab at the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center. We said, Ricardo, can you do this? And he said, yeah, no problem. So we started working on flood sensor technology, which was being developed in other municipalities around the country, but they were very expensive. And Ricardo was very interested in making these cheap, so that they could be like of the public. He wanted them cheap enough that a community member could buy a flood sensor if they wanted to. It wasn't like a $10,000 investment with the USGS. So he started working on that. And then the city, so again, like the end user comes to us, right? Then the city said, well, NYU engineers are working on something very similar. You guys should work together. So we started working together. I'm talking way ahead of my slide, but that's okay. I'm telling you a story, right? Yeah, so NYU was working on a very similar project. And so we started talking to NYU, and the city was helping facilitate this collaboration. The collaboration grew. More people became involved, and then Hurricane Ida and came through. You guys remember Hurricane Ida, right? Came in. It was devastating for the city. Shut down the transportation. There were some fatalities. People drowned in their basement apartments. And the city said, we think that the flood sensors are going to be an important part of the city's response to this tragedy. Among other policies and programs we have in the works, but we want to expand the flood sensor network. So after a year of working with them, they just fully funded the FloodNet project. Okay, see, I got way ahead of myself, but I'll talk about FloodNet in a second. But that's significant. And since that work has started, we are getting requests from community members, either individual residents or civic associations that are emailing us, telling us where they think we should put a flood sensor, right? So the communities are engaged with this because they see the potential benefits of this technology. But one other thing that I think is really important, and one of my proudest achievements in the last year, was we convinced the city that in order for this program to be really effective and embraced by communities around the city, we need a full-time community engagement coordinator to help us facilitate, maintain the connections that we have with the communities we're already in, but also help us build new connections, right? So the city agreed to this. We just interviewed like 3 outstanding candidates last week. We should be bringing one on board in March, right? So anyways, FloodNet in a nutshell. We have these super cool sonic sensors that, by the way, am I standing right in your way? You guys can't see it, right? So this is one of the sensors. It unfortunately looks like a camera, and a reporter on NY1 pointed that out, which was bad. So we also have to convince people that this is not surveillance because they're concerned about that, right? But anyways, the sensors are really simple technology. It's just a little sonar. It's just constantly bouncing sound beams off the sidewalk. They're very accurate to less than an inch accuracy. we mount them just on the U channels on signposts, so this we have blanket permission from the city to mount them on any city signpost right now. We have gateways placed around the city, which passively just collect information from up, it can collect information from any sensor that's within range. And that's transmitted to a server, and we've developed a dashboard to make this information publicly available in real time. We currently have sensors installed in every borough. It's been a pilot program up to this point, so we only have 31 sensors right now. We need 50 by June and 500 by 2027, which is harder than it might sound. The mayor loves FloodNet, so he highlighted this project at his press conference commemorating the 1-year anniversary of Hurricane Ida. And the tragic loss of life. He almost walked away with this, but fortunately one of his handlers took it back just before he got into his big SUV. And it produces useful data, right? So just as an example, so these are some data from a sensor we had deployed at Smith and Vine Street in the Gowanus neighborhood, Hoyt and Fifth, and Carroll and Fourth, all in the Gowanus neighborhood. And these little lumps here are the double flooding peak that were experienced during Hurricane Henri. So and these little dashed lines here are that's the precipitation. Don't ask me exactly where that data are sourced. I can't remember, but this particular, so here's rainfall on the left axis, and then here's the street flood depth on the y-axis, right? So Henri put about 2 feet of water on the street in this particular location. And we were able to sort of, and almost in 30 inches at Carroll and Fourth, less so at Hoyt and Fifth, right? So we're starting to acquire this like really hyper-local information about where the floodwaters are during different events, which eventually will help things like the Stevens Flood Advisory System. They'll give it the capability of sort of like fine-tuning its forecast and really giving people like really granular information about what kind of hazards that they might experience during an event. This is Hurricane Ida. That was just a single peak storm, but the flood depths were slightly more. So again, like 30 inches at these two locations and a little less at Hoyt and Fifth. We have 2 sensors installed in the Rockaways right now, one at Beach 84th Street and one at Beach 43rd Street. The interesting thing about the sensor at Beach 43rd Street, so this is, we didn't have a sensor out there until December 22nd of this past year. And 3 days before that December 23rd storm that caused widespread flooding across the city, Philip Horton from the Stevens Institute of Technology was communicating with his research network and saying, I don't like to be alarmist about anything. He's like, but this storm has the potential to put more water on the streets that people have seen since Sandy. That information, we were putting that information out through our channels, which are fairly limited, right? But that knowledge was not widespread. Most people were caught unawares by that December 23rd storm. But we knew also from previous research that that this was a location that might experience significant amount of water associated with the storm. So 2 people from our team actually ran out there the day before and threw that sensor up on Beach 43rd so that we could see how accurate flood maps are that have been generated in the past. And so this is about a 2-week period of, or actually a 3-week period or a 1-month period of flood sensor data. But this is that December 23rd event. The blue trace, which is Beach 84th Street, they saw almost 40 inches of water on their street during that storm. And the Beach 43rd, where we ran out and placed the sensor, saw about 2 feet of water, 24 inches of water. Also note, it's hard to see this pale blue line, but this shows the flooding on Beach 84th Street that occurs twice a month every month. just associated with the full moon and the new moon. This is a particularly susceptible location for flooding, to the point where they even call the police sometimes, so that they can like come pick up their kids and get them to the school bus stop, because they can't wade through the water to the end of the street to catch the bus. So this is some of the value of the flood sensors, right? You can imagine all kinds of different potential uses of this, right? You can send alerts to people's phones. You can notify emergency services within the city about where to direct resources. You can feed this information to the research community, so for like post-event analysis and for refining models. The National Weather Service is always asking us for the data as part of like their post-event assessments and summaries. And communities want this information so that they can bring it to their community boards, to their New York City Council members, to their New York State Assembly members, and say, we're hurting here. We have this hard information. You ignored our 311 calls, but you can't ignore this sensor that you paid for. This is what we're experiencing, and they can advocate for themselves using this information, right? So we try to help them understand and interpret the information in the context of all the other information that's available to them. Yeah, just some more examples of the flooding. This is Russell Street in Hamilton Beach, and you can see the clear correlation between street flooding, which is this little peak here, and the tidal phase during these sort of new moon and full moon periods. So really useful, and when we have 500 of these, they're going to be even more useful. So that's one example of like the user-driven work that we do that sort of sits at the interface between what the city needs, what the residents need, and what the research community is interested in and needs as well. Another example, I'm going to go through some examples of projects that we're doing in our growing portfolio of nature-based solutions work, which is, New York City, to its credit, is really embracing the idea of nature-based solutions as part of its portfolio of solutions to climate adaptation and also to water quality issues. So again, the West Pond is a place in the middle of Jamaica Bay, the Jamaica Bay Wildlife Refuge. It was impacted by Hurricane Sandy. During Sandy, the berm that created this artificial freshwater pond was breached. And eventually the National Park Service repaired it. But the area started experiencing heavy erosion again almost right away. So they had to make a decision, like, what do we do about this? Do we put in some riprap? Do we put in a seawall? Someone pitched, let's try a living shoreline. So we weren't involved in it at that point, but a conservancy came around and said we can help facilitate the construction of a living shoreline at the West Pond. So they went out, they got the permits, they found the landscape architecture firm, they facilitated the creation of this living shoreline, which was essentially, they regraded the shoreline, they brought in a bunch of fill from previous projects around the bay, graded the shoreline, and then did a bunch of plantings. They planted a lot of marsh grasses, a lot of spartina, a lot of Disticus spicata, etc. And then they wanted to use 100% recycled materials as part of the structural components of that. So they put in some core logs, right? The coconut fiber logs. They created these breakwaters out of recycled oyster shell wrapped in coconut fiber nets. And they created these fascines out of Christmas trees. So like think about like mini groins, out of recycled Christmas trees wrapped in more core fiber. But you do a project like this, and I was just having a conversation with Barry earlier about the need to monitor projects like this after the construction, and not just to satisfy the permit, but also to learn, inform potential adaptive management, and disseminate that information, share that knowledge to a wider network, right? So, so the Conservancy, the Jamaica Bay Rockaway Parks Conservancy, asked if we could take on doing some post-construction monitoring. So they came up with a modest amount of funds. We said, sure, we can do that. And so this past summer was our first year of going out and collecting information about the elevation, about the condition of the plants, about the usage of the site by organisms, But also thinking about the potential socioeconomic connections to this type of project, et cetera. Right. So that's one very small sort of nature-based solution project that we're working on. The Department of Environmental Protection is the city agency that gets pointed at for being in violation of the Clean Water Act. And so the state is requiring them to take specific actions to try to mitigate those violations of the Clean Water Act. So they had to come up with what's called a long-term control plan for the sewage discharges that occur around the city. And the state suggested certain things that the DEP could do, like chlorinate the combined sewer overflows, build more wastewater treatment capacity. So all kinds of like sort of hard infrastructure potential solutions to this. But the DEP, to their credit, said, you know what, that's great. We would like to try to use some more nature-based approaches to mitigating water quality issues. And so they wanted to try two approaches. One is they wanted to use marine tidal wetlands as a potential way to remove pathogens from CSO discharges. And so they built this this little pilot scale wetland up in Alley Creek, which is up in Queens on the north shore of the city. But they needed to evaluate its ability to perform this, and they could have gone to their usual stable of consulting firms to do that, but they wanted to engage what they thought would be a more credible group, which would be like the research community to do this, which I like, right? So they came to us to help facilitate that, right? So we found the expertise. Diane Greenfield at the CUNY Advanced Science Research Center and Greg O'Mullen at Queens College were very interested in this project. They're very satisfied with this project because they said they're sick of identifying problems and they really want to engage in solutions. So they want to be involved in seeing if this was a solution. So now we have to do some research to evaluate the effectiveness of this constructed wetland in removing pathogens from raw sewage discharges, so that the DEP can go back to the state and see if they can do more of these. So here's just a nice photo. They actually did a really nice job with the actual wetland itself. The vegetation really grew in. It looks beautiful out there, actually. The other one, which is a really big, ambitious idea, which may or may not work, is they wanted to install 7 acres of rib mussels in the highly polluted tributaries on either side of JFK Airport as a way to sort of filter out the bad stuff during raw sewage discharges. This has never been tried before. There has been some preliminary work starting to look at the feasibility of such approach. So a NOAA researcher did a little bit of a pilot program off of Soundview in the Bronx to look at whether she could culture rib mussels in a subtidal environment suspended from a raft in the middle of the water column, and some researchers from Stony Brook, so Bassam, in collaboration with some people from the Cornell Cooperative Extension. We're looking at the ability of these rib mussels to actually filter out the pathogens that would be the target of this work. So it went from a beaker scale to more like a lab mesocosm scale. Demonstrated the feasibility of the mussel. The mussels can do it. But now the trick is, can we go from like the beaker and lab mesocosm scale to something that might look like 7 acres of rib mussels, right? So again, the DEP came to us and they said, can you help facilitate this work? And so we're now doing this project. It's a collaboration between Chester Zarnock at Baruch College, Stony Brook, Cornell Cooperative Extension, Hazen and Sawyer, which is a large consulting firm in the city. And we've got basically 2 years to really demonstrate the potential of this. And if it works, it'll be the one of its kind of solutions around the world, right? But there's so many challenges to overcome. So much basic research that needs to be done about rib mussels, and so much engineering work that needs to be done to think about a 7-acre installation and how you would maintain and care for it. So here's an example. So this, I think this was from the pilot project that went off of Soundview in the Bronx, which is giving the DP hope that it might be possible, right? So those are some examples. I think on the nature-based solution in particular, just over the past few years, the Institute has sort of become like the hub for this growing community of practice around nature-based solutions. I would love to get more people from Stony Brook involved in that as it grows. We're going to become a node in the Network for Engineering with Nature, which is the Army Corps of Engineers, University of Georgia project. We've got with New York Sea Grant, we've got a U.S. Coastal Research Program grant to start to convene that community of practice, learn about successful and unsuccessful nature-based solution projects. What can we learn from those, and how can we do these kind of projects around the city? We just recently also started a project looking at the regulatory and policy barriers to nature-based solution implementation, which are many around the city. So we're facilitating that, bringing our expertise, but also bringing together all these different entities like New York City Parks, the Department of State, New York Department of State, Army Corps, et cetera. So we can work through these issues. How am I doing on time? I haven't even
Got about 10 minutes left, so.
This is my last slide. So the last thing I just wanted to mention is that again, remember the National Park Service is one of our partners, and one of the things that they've always wanted to see was the Institute help to reimagine Floyd Bennett Field, which sits on Jamaica Bay, as a hub of research, education, engagement, and workforce development around urban sustainability, urban ecology, and climate adaptation. So we're working with them right now to have a facility at Floyd Bennett Field that can be used by researchers and students and the public in a collaborative way, maybe even catalyze transdisciplinary work. And so right now the current vision is that this building down here, building 26, an old sheet metal shop at Floyd Bennett Field, is going to hopefully become an Institute field station, which can help facilitate field work in Jamaica Bay. I know a lot of Stony Brook researchers come down our way once in a while to work in the bay. You tow your boats, you bring all your gear in a pickup truck. It'd be nice, right, to have a shelter and a bathroom and a place to hang your waders when you come down that way, right? And the other half of this building we envision as an education and public engagement space. We have the capital funding for that. We have the partnership for that, and we're starting to build out potential programming around that, which I would love to talk to anyone that's interested in it. So we have this programming idea to create what we're calling for now the Urban Futures Hub, which will be a place where not just physical and social scientists come together, but also artists and humanists to dream about nature-based solutions in New York City, and what those could look like, how to and really be innovative in that space. So it would be a place where we can really engage our next generation, which are our students, right? And also engage community members around this, right? So that's what we're working on. That's sort of another big initiative of ours. It's not really a research focus, but more of like a capacity building effort. And that is it. That's me, in case you want to reach out and email me. And you can also go to our website, which is the greatest website yet, but you can go there if you wish. A little bit.
So we have time for a couple questions before we head to lunch. So. Yeah, Stephen.
How many people are at the Resilience Institute. I mean, one of the challenges I think for a boundary institution is that's a complex job. I mean, you're dealing with all sorts of stakeholders. You're dealing with people that might have contracts that are basically, pushing their own agendas. And sometimes they don't talk to each other that well. There's also a communication component to that. You feel like you're getting enough support to build out the personnel to manage all of that?
We are heading in the right direction, which I might not have told you that 3 years ago when I first took over. Things did not look great 3 years ago. We are definitely trending in the right direction, right? So especially because these city contracts are allowing us to hire full-time people to help with that, right? Like I already mentioned, the community engagement coordinator.
Yeah.
So even though they're being hired on the FloodNet project, you can't really isolate their work from all the other engagement work that's going on around the day, right? So as they forge connections or help us maintain the connections that we already have, we can also bring other efforts, other programs, other connections along with them. And that will help,
So
right?
Your vision is to expand out and sort of deal with these different tasks.
Right, yeah. The Institute, it was a little frustrating at the beginning, right? Because everyone was really excited about the Institute. But a lot of money didn't come to hire out full-time staff needed to achieve its vision, right? But we're getting there now. We're getting there now. And to the point where it's time for the general agreement to be renegotiated with the city and the National Park Service. And right now, they are excited about what's happening. So they want to engage in that. And we think now, success brings success, right? So we brought in this money to do these projects that were important to those stakeholders. So now we're in a position of strength to go pursue some like real funding to keep it going, right? I don't know if that answered your question, but
No, that's trying to,
Yeah.
because I remember
Yeah.
being very mystified by
Yeah.
what exactly 3 or 4 years ago, what exactly the Resilience Institute was
Yeah.
doing, because it didn't have a lot of independent support for
right.
managing this a really complex set of problems. In Canada, in California, dealing with the Bay Delta, for instance, was like multi-billion-dollar problem.
Right.
And it's got a similar kind of profile.
What I would like to see happen, over the next couple of years is I mentioned New York Sea Grant a couple of times, right? And they've been critical because they put a person in the office. They're Sea Grant, but they're doing the work with the Institute and helping to build that programming. And then recently we were able to get a postdoc from the Army Corps through their Network for Engineering and Nature program, who is now there. And that person is having a synergistic impact and actually is creating new opportunities to continue to grow, right? Why couldn't there be a Stony Brook person that's sort of like embedded in the Institute? They're Stony Brook, but they're also part of the Institute, and they are helping to connect what we're doing with the expertise here. And I mean, not just someone who's like on a call once in a while, like someone who's physically there. So they are part of like the day-to-day. That's what I would like to see from partners, right? We kind of have that going on with NYU because they're right up the road. So they're a big partner in FloodNet. We talk to them all the time, right? And that partnership is growing, and they keep bringing more resources, to the table for this, being people. So that's what we need, we need people. Yes.
It sounds like you're on the way to make all these contacts, but I just have kind of maybe a detailed question, but I'm wondering what your relationship is with the Jamaica Bay Task Force, which is the biggest community-based group in Jamaica Bay doing this for years. And I've never noticed you at any of the meetings, so.
No, I'm there sometimes. Sometimes they schedule them when I can't go, but yeah, no, I talk, so yeah, the Mondays, obviously, that are in.
But it's really a wide-based group, and probably requires, I think you need to be more integrated with them. As an outsider, I think that's something that needs a lot more. Because they really, for years, have been the kind of the major groups working in Jamaica Bay.
Yeah, well,
Still
yeah,
are.
the task force is primarily involved with directing resources, capital resources, restoration money, for example, to the bay, right? That's what the monies will tell you, right? That they'll tell you how many millions of dollars worth of marsh restoration money that they brought to Jamaica Bay, right? So what they do is complementary, right? Like their mission is different. They do help with getting information out, right, with their task force meetings. But you know, we talk to the principals of the Jamaica Bay Task Force frequently.
Okay.
You tell me, trust me, that if Dan Money Jr. does not like something that we're doing, I hear about it.
He'll tell you what
Yeah.
nasty things, whether he does or not, but
Yeah.
but they are, I mean, they are the major marsh restoring people in Jamaica Bay. So
Right.
in fact, they're doing things identical and objective, and I think you probably improve some of their work by talking with them.
But I also would push back a little bit that they're the biggest community representative. I think that they would like to think that they represent all the communities around Jamaica Bay, but I think there's a lot of other community organizations. I never see anyone from Canarsie at the Jamaica Bay Task Force meetings, or anyone from Edgemere.
They're still the biggest organization. I
Yeah.
mean, you're right, there are things that don't belong, but
Yeah.
it's quite broad, isn't it?
They're basically Broad Channel and Howard Beach, right? Primarily.
No, a lot more than that, actually. You should go to the meetings.
No, I do go to the meetings.
Yeah, you know more.
Michael.
Okay, I was just curious whether the FloodNet data are available in real time or if there's any plans for that to happen.
Yes, available in real time, and if I was smart, I would have put the link. I will. Yeah, it's, if you go to floodnet.nyc, you can access the real-time dashboard there.
But I would think particularly in the future, as the program builds the weather service, I'd love to access them.
Yeah,
We could use that out here.
Yeah, they're building in, you know, like, they're building up like the API capabilities, right? Because a lot of people are asking, just like, can we just like pull the data into to our applications? So they're readily available. There's still some work to be done, right? So you can imagine some of the challenges with a street sensor, like just something hanging, pointing down at the sidewalk, right? So like anytime someone puts a bag of trash beneath one,
Right, so
you're gonna see that, right?
we did-
So we're working on, I can even tell you one story, like there was one sensor, it was 000, and then it was 18 inches. And then finally we sent someone from our team out there, and someone had put like a little children's desk, like out for trash disposal, and it was like exactly 18 inches to the little desktop. So there's like filtering that still needs to be done. People are working on like those kind of algorithms. But with that caveat, the data are readily available.
Are the sensors readily available? In other words, could somebody
Yes.
here get involved with you and?
Yes, 100%, absolutely. Everything that the engineers are doing is publicly available on GitHub. Including like, you know, we are producing, we do have to mass produce these now since we need 500. So there are like some design for manufacturing plans, but like, you know, we actually run makeathons with communities. Like everything is an off-the-shelf component. And so, you know, all the like the code, the construction drawing, all the components, that's all readily available. It's all open source, which was hard to get the city to agree to, but.
So maybe I'll ask one last question. It's a follow-up on this, which is there a strategy for deploying these as they become available? Because, right, so you mentioned this project, but then you also mentioned some of the opportunities for flood mitigation.
Yeah.
Because, right, one of the best tools to show that it would be working would be get these sensors in areas before you do restoration, nature-based restorations, or even, something more infrastructure-based, because then you could actually measure the impact.
Yeah, no, that's a great question. Where do you choose where to put a sensor? There's a lot of different factors, right? So the city has some locations that they're interested in because of infrastructure, like a subway entrance, for example. Researchers have some suggestions. We're getting a lot of input from community members. They're like, oh, well, this intersection floods all the time. You should put one here. What we're trying to do is come up with a sort of objective way of optimizing sensor placement, so it's equitable in terms of their distribution. So bringing in different types of like vulnerability factors, but also, and looking at like the infrastructure. It is a little complicated, right? Like I remember one New York Assembly member told me that the first 50 sensors should all be in the Rockaways. And that's not going to happen. Because they have to be distributed in a way that are most impactful. So it's a hard. We're trying to develop the algorithm to figure out where to put.
Yeah, I guess I'm also, I'm thinking from the perspective, if part of what the Resilience Institute is trying to do is show the success of mitigation and resilience measures, that actually having the data to show that could actually really give a lot of credibility. And so there could be other opportunities to every time there's a new resilience, you should probably be installing it for at least a year or two before. Because if you're not collecting the data before, then it's hard to, of course, there's other ways to show that you've improved the flooding, but.
No, excellent point. And that's like some of the things that the DP, some of the locations they suggest are partially due to that, because they might do an infrastructure project there. Et cetera. Yeah, no, that's a good point.
I mean, it could also be really useful to the city because they could see where sometimes their storm drainage systems are becoming clogged. You might be able to see, if this isn't supposed to be flooding and it's flooding. I wonder how, from a practical standpoint, like how they could use this in the long run too. So, all right, well, we should probably head over to lunch. So everybody, if we could thank Brett one more time.